testing interviews. Usually, interviews start with basic concepts, move to intermediate questions, and finally focus on senior-level real-time scenarios. So in this video, I'll cover basic, intermediate, and senior Playwright interview questions along with real-time examples. Let's get started. First question, tell me about your experience in testing automation. Sample answer, I have around X years of experience in software testing, mainly in UI automation testing using Playwright with JavaScript TypeScript. I have worked on building automation frameworks from scratch using Playwright Test Runner, followed page object model design pattern, handled cross-browser testing like Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit. I have automated modules like login, forms, dashboards, and handled real-time scenarios like dynamic elements, drop-downs, alerts, file uploads, and multi-tab handling. Also integrated Playwright tests with CI/CD tools like Jenkins GitHub Actions and generated reports using HTML Allure. What is Playwright, and why is it preferred over Selenium? Answer. Playwright is an open-source automation testing tool developed by Microsoft used for end-to-end testing of web applications. It is preferred over Selenium because Playwright supports auto-weighting, supports multiple browsers out of the box, faster execution compared to Selenium, handles modern applications like SPA easily, supports parallel execution, network interception, and API testing support. How does Playwright architecture differ from Selenium WebDriver? Answer. Playwright uses a direct communication model with the browser through WebSocket, whereas Selenium WebDriver follows a client-server architecture where commands are sent via HTTP to the browser driver. In Selenium, test scripts communicate with WebDriver, which then talks to the browser driver like Chrome driver. But in Playwright, there is no separate driver. It directly communicates with a browser engine, which makes execution faster and more reliable. Example. In our project, Selenium tests were slower due to WebDriver communication delay. But after migrating to Playwright, execution time was reduced because Playwright directly interacts with a browser without using Chrome driver or Gecko driver. Which browsers are supported by Playwright? Playwright supports Chromium, Firefox, WebKit. Difference between Page.Locator and Page. Page.Locator supports auto-weighting and retries until the element is available. Page. Immediately finds the element and returns null if not found. Locator is recommended because it handles dynamic elements better. How do you launch a browser in Playwright? In Playwright, we launch the browser using browser-specific launch methods like Chromium.Launch to start a new browser instance programmatically. What is a locator? Locator is a way to identify and interact with web elements in Playwright. Difference between selector and locator? Selector is a string used to identify element like CSS or XPath. Locator is a Playwright object which uses selector internally and supports auto-weight and retry mechanism. How do you click an element? In Playwright, we use locator methods to interact with web elements. The click method is used to perform click action on buttons, links, or any clickable element. Playwright automatically waits for the element to be visible and enabled before clicking. How do you enter text into a text box? To enter text into input fields, Playwright provides the fill method. It clears the existing value and types the new value into the text box. How do you check a checkbox? We can use the check method to select a checkbox. Playwright ensures the checkbox is checked only if it is not already selected. How do you handle dropdowns? Playwright provides the select option method to handle dropdown elements. We can select a value using visible text, value, or index. How do you upload a file? File upload in Playwright is handled using the set input files method. It is mainly used for input elements with type as file. How do you handle alerts in Playwright? Alerts in Playwright are handled using dialog event listeners. We listen to the dialog event and then accept or dismiss the alert. What is the default timeout in Playwright? By default, Playwright has a timeout of 30 seconds for each action or locator. How do you run a single test file? We can run a specific test file using Playwright Test Runner from the command line by providing the file name. npx playwright test login.spec.js. How do you run tests in headed mode? By default, Playwright runs tests in headless mode. To execute tests in headed mode, we use the headed flag. Next, intermediate level. What is browser context in Playwright? Answer. Browser context is an isolated environment within a browser instance, which acts like a separate browser profile having its own cookies, cache, and session storage. Difference between browser and context? Answer. Browser is the actual application instance, whereas browser context is like an incognito session created inside the browser to maintain test isolation. How do you handle multiple tabs? Answer. Multiple tabs can be handled by listening to the new page event from the browser context. How do you run tests in parallel? Answer. Playwright supports parallel execution by default using multiple workers configured in playwright.config.js. Workers. 4. How do you run tests in serial mode? Answer. Serial execution can be achieved using method or fixtures in Playwright. Answer. Fixtures are reusable setup and teardown functions used to initialize test environment before execution. Have you created custom fixtures? Answer. Yes, custom fixtures can be created for login setup and browser initialization to avoid code duplication across tests. How do you reuse login in multiple tests? Answer. Login can be reused by saving authentication state using storage state and loading it in other test cases. What is storage state? Answer. Storage state stores cookies and local storage data of logged-in session in a JSON file. Where did you use storage state in your project? Answer. Storage state is used to maintain login session across multiple test cases to avoid repeated login steps. How do you automate dynamic elements? Answer. Dynamic elements can be handled using relative locators like text, inf, contains, or role-based locators. How do you handle elements without ID or class? Answer. XPath, CSS with parent-child relationship, or Playwright recommended locators like getByText or getByRole can be used. How do you download a file and verify it? Answer. File download is handled using download event and then verifying file path. How do you debug failing tests? Answer. Debugging can be done using Playwright Inspector, debug mode, or trace viewer. What is Playwright Inspector? Answer. Playwright Inspector is a debugging tool to step through test execution and inspect elements during runtime. What is CodeGen? Answer. CodeGen is a Playwright tool used to generate automation scripts by recording user interactions. How do you capture screenshots on failure? Answer. Screenshots can be captured using test hooks like after each when a test fails, or annotations like skip or only. Answer. Annotations like test.skip or test that only are used to skip or run specific test cases during execution. Next, senior level. What is the difference between browser context, and page in Playwright? Answer. Browser is the main application instance. Browser context is an isolated session inside the browser, like an incognito window, and page represents an individual tab. In real-time projects, we create multiple contexts to simulate different users without launching multiple browsers. Example. Why do we use browser context instead of opening multiple browser instances? Answer. Using multiple browser instances consumes more memory and increases execution time. Browser context provides session isolation within the same browser, improving performance during parallel execution. Example. We executed admin and user tests in parallel using different contexts instead of two browsers. What is storage state, and where have you used it in your real project? Answer. Storage state stores login session details like cookies and local storage in a JSON file. In our project, we used it to avoid logging in before every test case, which reduced execution time significantly. Example. How do you handle login reuse across hundreds of test cases? Answer. We capture authentication state after login and store it using storage state. Then load the same state in other test cases to directly start execution from logged-in state. Example. If your Playwright test fails intermittently in CI, how would you troubleshoot it? Answer. Flaky tests are handled using stable locators, Playwright auto-waiting, retry logic, and removing hard-coded waits. Example. Retries 2. Developers haven't added IDs or test attributes. How would you automate such elements? Answer. We use role-based locators, text locators, or parent-child XPath strategies to uniquely identify elements. Example. How do you run Playwright tests in CI/CD pipelines like Jenkins or GitHub Actions? Answer. We integrate Playwright test execution commands in Jenkins file or GitHub workflow YAML to trigger automation during build or deployment. Example. npm run test. Your UI depends on a slow third-party API. How would you test this scenario? Answer. We intercept network requests using page.route and provide custom mock responses to test different scenarios. Example. How do you run parallel tests for multiple user roles like admin and user? Answer. We create separate storage state files for admin and user roles and execute tests in parallel using multiple workers. Example. If a test fails only occasionally in CI, how do you investigate the root cause? Answer. Trace Viewer provides step-by-step execution details like screenshots, network logs, and actions, which helps in debugging failed tests in CI. Example. How do you design a Playwright framework from scratch? Answer. We design framework using Playwright Test Runner, Implement page object model, create reusable fixtures, environment configs, and integrate reporting tools. Example, created login page.js inside pages folder. Have you implemented page object model? Answer, yes. POM is implemented to separate page locators and test logic, which improves code, reusability, and maintainability. Example, how do you manage test data across environments? Answer, we use environment-specific configuration or JSON files to manage test data for QA, stage, or production. Example, how do you avoid code duplication in test scripts? Answer, code duplication is avoided by using reusable functions, custom fixtures, and page object model. Example, created common login function in util. How do you validate workflows involving different user roles like admin and user? Answer, we create separate authentication states for each user role and load them during test execution. Example, how do you run tests on different environments like QA or stage? Answer, environment variables are used to switch execution between QA and stage environments. Example, how do you validate file downloads in headless mode? Answer, we capture download events and verify the downloaded file name or path. Example, how do you capture network API responses? Answer, network responses are captured using page.onListener. Example, where do you apply retry logic? Answer, retry logic is configured at test runner level to rerun failed test cases automatically. Example, retries too. How do you automate applications built using React? Answer, we use role-based or text-based locators to handle frequently changing DOM elements. Example, how do you handle dynamic tables? Answer, dynamic tables are handled using locator chaining or relative XPath. Example, how do you run dependent test cases? Answer, dependent test cases are executed using serial execution mode. Example,